Oh, we're live. Cool. All right. Hey, everyone. I see it says live in the corner of my screen, so I'm going to assume that everyone can see me. I suppose if you start waving in the chat, then I'll know for sure. But yeah, welcome to the final session of the second day of Virtual CEMS 2020. And so let's see, we've got 3 presentations. The first one with the discussant. And so, yeah, it's my pleasure to introduce Jim Kragel, who is a postdoc at Northwestern University and was once a graduate student at Vanderbilt University with yours truly. And he'll be telling us about temporal context and how it guides visual exploration during scene recognition. And so, yeah, take it away, Jim.
Awesome, thanks, Sean. Let me share my slides real quick. All right, so can you see my slides all right? All right, thanks. So this is really some nice work that I'm very excited to share with everyone, kind of bridging my previous work in the realm of free recall with newer studies looking at eye movements. The whole idea is that we all know our episodic memories are temporally organized. When we remember the past, we tend to replay prior experiences as opposed to remembering events in a random piecemeal fashion. And the research I'm going to share with you today focuses on understanding what generates this temporal organization and also what kinds of behaviors can be temporally organized. So within the domain of psychology, temporal organization is most commonly studied with list learning paradigms such as free recall. So here I'm just showing you a simple encoding list of 6 items. And then if you ask a subject to remember these items in any order, the very common effect that's been mentioned in previous talks is temporal contiguity. So you tend to recall items that were presented nearby in time consecutively. So here I'm showing you the recall sequence, sheep, moon, and then dress. And the idea is if you're organizing your memory by time, you'll consecutively recall adjacent items. And so this comes about as showing a temporal contiguity effect in recall. So here on the y-axis, just the probability of recalling an item given that you just recalled an item at a specific temporal lag. And so there are kind of 2 features of this curve that I want to focus on for the rest of the talk. One is the contiguity effect, just the idea shorter lags are more likely to be recalled, and then forward asymmetry, so you're more likely to go in the forward direction than the backward direction. And so there are a number of computational models that, so for example, a temporal context model that attribute this process or organization in time of your memories to the reinstatement of temporal context, which you can think of as a slowly integrating representation that can give you information about where in time you are mentally. And the idea is that reinstatement, when you recall an item, if you reinstate the temporal context associated with that item, it provides an effective retrieval cue, allowing you to remember things that occurred nearby in time. So while this is very well established in the domain of free recall, there have been relatively few studies that have looked like how my reinstatement of temporal context influence other types of behaviors. So here I'm going to look at memory-guided visual exploration. As people, we're very visual creatures. We go about the day looking around and recognizing our environment all the time. How might temporal context play a role in this? So in order to study this question, we're going to combine eye tracking with memory paradigms. So here I'm just going to play a little video clip showing you how you can take just viewing behavior for a simple scene and translate it into an encoding sequence. Each position on the scene here, numbered position, corresponds to 1 fixation. I'm highlighting a circle that corresponds to about 2 degrees of visual angle. And you can really think of this, if you want to translate it back into recall-like behavior, you're really just, because the fovea has higher visual acuity, you're getting more information at the regions that you foveate. So you can almost think of this just as an encoding sequence of different visual content, different spatial locations broken across the entire encoding episode. So if temporal context does drive your behavior when you're viewing a scene, you might then imagine when you're viewing the same scene again at a later point in time that the distribution of your eye movements over time is influenced by your memory. So here, consider the first 3 fixations that you might make during retrieval. So you look at these 3 locations, and then what we want to do is say, how similar are these locations to where you looked at the first time you viewed the scene? So here you can see there's a good correspondence between location 1 at encoding and location 2 during recognition, so on for the second position, whereas for the third fixation, it's a new location. They didn't really attend to this fish on the wall during encoding, but they did it at retrieval. And so then we can further look for evidence of temporal reinstatement by looking at the transitions in these sequences according to their encoding positions. So here, the first transition at retrieval actually corresponds to a lag of +1. And so if you might imagine reinstatement occurring, you would make a lot of these transitions in the same way you might do in a recall sequence. So then at the same time, there's another kind of transition I want to highlight. So they're just completing the rest of the recognition sequence here. And then consider the last 3 fixations that the subject makes. So recognition fixation 7, here looking at this little bottle on the nightstand before they return to look at this fish twice that they did happen to look at essentially underneath the fish earlier on the encoding sequence. So here they're actually making a repetition. So they view the same location multiple times, and you might imagine this is very important for being able to recognize a scene. If there's a scene with certain salient features in it, repeated inspection of the scene would then allow you to recognize, I remember this being in the scene. It triggers your memory and allows you to make the correct behavioral decision. So given we have this approach to kind of study or to kind of break down a viewing sequence and understand how temporal context might guide memory-driven viewing, we can kind of make some predictions about what behavioral results might look like. So here, rather than the typical conditional response probability curve, the CRP curve, we're going to be looking at viewing probability curves. They're essentially telling you the same thing, except we're adding a lagged 0 describing repeats. And if temporal context drives viewing behavior just as it drives recall behavior, we'd expect a very similar looking curve with contiguity effect and forward asymmetry. In contrast, if subjects just tend to randomly look about previously viewed locations, then you'd expect this curve to be flat. All right, and so another kind of big caveat with this whole idea is there's a lot of work and very nice modeling work showing that based on the low-level visual and higher level cognitive properties of scenes, you can predict where people are going to look. So how do we know it's actually memory and not just stimulus properties driving where people look? And so there's another analysis that I'm going to introduce throughout the talk where we compare the fixations that one subject makes at recognition to all of the other fixations that all of the other subjects make during encoding. And the idea here is that this analysis will capture effects that are consistent across subjects, but then obviously don't rely on memory, as you don't have access to what other subjects did during the encoding phase of the task. So the idea is we can build null distributions from all of these different fixation behaviors and get an idea of how consistent just the stimulus properties alone might drive certain transitions between locations on the scene. So with this approach, as I mentioned, we can take the average across all the different mixture of subjects at encoding and retrieval, and we can get a measure of stimulus-driven viewing behavior. So just how much, and this is just a hypothetical for what it might look like here on the left. And so we can build these distributions. We can then compare them to the actual viewing behavior when you compare a subject's encoding behavior to their own recognition behavior. And then we can adjust their actual observed behavior based on these null distributions. And so throughout the talk, if you see a label with adjusted CVP curve, that's really just this, it should reflect memory-driven processes after accounting for stimulus-driven viewing. Whereas through other points, I'll just show you the effects of stimulus-driven viewing behaviors or just the raw data. So given we have these tools to kind of see whether or not temporal context might guide viewing, we're going to test 3 predictions of retrieved context models. The idea being, if the same memory processes drive recall organization that drive viewing behavior, we should see correspondence between recall dynamics and viewing dynamics during repeated viewing. So the first prediction that we're going to test in study 1 is really straightforward. It's just, is there a contiguity effect? Does it occur more so during accurate scene recognition? You can imagine if you correctly reinstate the sequence of eye movements you made, that will lead to better memory. The second prediction relates to the forward asymmetry that I mentioned previously. And the idea is that from retrieved context models, there are 2 types of contextual information that drive the contiguity effect. There's slowly integrating experimental context that provides a symmetrical cue for retrieval. And then there's the idea that you can integrate pre-experimental context, really information about under what context certain item information occur in the environment, that becomes built into your slowly changing context representation. And when this is brought back to mind later, it provides a forward-going cue for memory search. And then so the idea is that if we manipulate what kind of scene content people are viewing, maybe that'll manipulate how likely they are to reinstate forward as opposed to backward fixation sequences. And then finally, the third prediction that we want to test is whether or not contiguity effects that we observe are timescale invariant. So the idea that while you might reinstate scan paths within one specific viewing episode, do you also see long range effects where if you view the same scene multiple times, are you more biased to retrieve information from recent episodes? So we're going to start off looking at the first prediction. So this is a study from Odalova's group at MIT, and it's looking at a continuous recognition task where subjects viewed a sequence of about 1,000 images. And so critically, about 210 or so of them repeat 3 times throughout the task, and the subject has to detect, have I seen this image before or not? And so they actually view the scene for a brief amount of time, and then after they complete viewing the scene, they have a recognition response time so that responding doesn't interfere with the eye movements during viewing. And so the question is, when we evaluate the data in this way, do we see a contiguity effect, and does it relate to memory function? So here on the top, I'm showing you just the raw conditional viewing probability curves. In blue, I'm showing you what it looks like when you get the recognition decision correct, and in orange, it's showing you incorrect responses, and on the bottom, it's showing you the difference between these two curves. And so, interestingly, there does look to be a lot of Scanpath reinstatement, so there are a lot of these +1 transitions where you make the same sequences of eye movements at recognition as you do during initial encoding, and more so when you correctly recognize the scene as opposed to when you don't recognize it. And it also looks like there's an increase for lag 0, so if you repeatedly look at portions of the scene that you've seen before, that's an indicator that you're probably going to get that recognition decision right. So how much of this is actually due to memory? How much of it might just be due to low-level stimulus properties? And so this is showing you the stimulus-driven conditional viewing probability curve. So how consistent are these behaviors across subjects if there's no memory going on? It looks like that's primarily, some of that is due to the repetition effect is due to that effect, but it doesn't really explain the reinstatement that we're seeing for +1 lag. So this is really just an indication, kind of confirming that prediction that we would see reinstatement of temporal sequences during scene recognition based on the eye movement behavior, and it's related to memory processing. So going to the next prediction that we want to test, how does the content that people look at influence the degree to which they make forward as opposed to backward or other transitions between their eye movements? And so this is actually going to be looking at 2 different studies from Peter Koenig's group. And the idea is it's fairly straightforward. So in the first study, 12 scenes per category. They view all of the scenes in a random order in 5 different blocks, so it's repeated 5 times. The study 3 is very similar, only the scene content is slightly different, so they're all urban scenes of either low, medium, or high complexity. And so that you can imagine that coming into this experiment, you have very different familiarity with these different types of scene content. You probably don't spend a lot of time looking at pink noise, whereas you probably have very good, pre-experimental conceptual knowledge of these other categories. You can imagine in study 3, you probably spend most of your time viewing urban settings from the medium complexity level. Hopefully don't spend a lot of time staring at the corner of a wall, or maybe you do spend a lot of time on rooftops, but that you might imagine that varies by individuals. All right, so what do these data look like? And so here you can see that, to me, this was actually really remarkable that these viewing probability curves look almost remarkably similar to the typical CRP curves that you see in recall data. But you can see there is a difference in the forward-going asymmetry. So here broken down by the individual category types, both for study 2, and then there's not so much going on for study 3, but you can see that for pink noise categories, you're almost symmetrical in your tendency to reinstate things in the forward-going direction, which indicates that your pre-experimental knowledge might be important for allowing you to reinstate these trajectories. We next looked how much of this was due to stimulus-driven viewing effects. So it actually looks like, this could be somewhat of a contradiction from previous predictions, but it may not necessarily be memory, but it looks like the stimulus-driven effects actually account for these forward-going asymmetries. Here in study 3, there actually is a significant effect here where you get more of a forward-going effect for medium as opposed to other complexity urban scenes.
About 4 minutes left.
Okay, and then the next natural question is then, given stimulus-driven viewing, stimulus properties can account for these differences in asymmetry. Is there still a memory-related effect going on? And so here I'm showing you what it looks like after controlling for stimulus-driven factors, and you can see there still is kind of a remaining memory effect, but it looks like it's insensitive to what the stimulus type or what the scene categories are. So kind of there's some contribution of memory that allows you to reinstate sequences of eye movements irrespective of what the content of the scenes are here, primarily just showing a strong increase at +1 lags. So that really kind of confirms that the scene content is going to influence how we view and remember these or recognize these scenes. Finally, we wanted to test and see whether or not these contiguity effects are timescale invariant. So up to this point, everything I've showed you is just within 2 viewing episodes of looking at the same scene. So you may have noticed that in studies 2 and 3, all the scenes were repeated 5 times. So how likely are you to reinstate from a more recent as opposed to a more distant episode in terms of which Scanpaths or sequences of eye movements you're likely to make? So this is data from study 2. For all these plots on the x-axis, I'm showing you the repetition distance. So if you remember, all of these experiments are shown in blocks, 5 sequential blocks of all of the scenes. And then the idea is we can look at how often you reinstate. We can compute the same reinstatement measures, but instead of looking at the most previous block, we can break it down. So for example, from block 5 to block 1 would give you a repetition distance of 4. And if it's a memory that's further away, you might imagine you're less likely to show reinstatement of eye movements that you made during that time. And that's precisely what we see in the raw data. So here on the left, you can see that so on the y-axis, it's just the probability that you make a +1 transition, really the strongest measure here that you're reinstating eye movements. And you can see that over time, you get lower and lower probabilities. And then on the right, it's really just showing you that this isn't really attributed to stimulus properties. Obviously, the properties of the scenes are the same. Each time you view them, it wouldn't really make sense for low-level visual properties to kind of change throughout the experiment. And we see roughly the same pattern of data when we look at study 3, that across these different viewing conditions, you're more likely to reinstate Scanpaths from more recent viewing episodes, and it doesn't look like this is driven by stimulus-driven factors. So on the right, you can see they're all essentially flat curves. All right, so this really confirms the idea that there are both long and short timescale contiguity effects. But so in general, we confirmed most of our predictions. So Scanpath reinstatement does look like it predicts successful scene recognition. There was a little bit of a hiccup in the prediction regarding prediction 2, whereas it didn't look like there's a difference in the memory-related differences in forward asymmetry. However, it does look like stimulus-driven viewing effects do cause differences in reinstatement when we're considering Scanpaths. And then finally, it does look like there are both short timescale and long timescale differences in terms of reinstatement of these sequences. So conclusions and future directions. Really, the main conclusion is that from this data, it looks like temporal context plays a role in organizing both episodic recall and how we interact visually with the environment. I would also like to just plug eye tracking as an awesome method for looking at sequential data. There are a number of reasons I think this is the case. One is that it doesn't require your subjects to make a memory response, so it's good for translational studies in different animal models. It's great for looking at development. And then at the same time, you also get a wealth of data. So a subject viewing 2 images gives you almost as much data as an entire recall trial. And then at the same time, it gives you insight into what's going on cognitively at very fast time scales, which is great for relating these kind of behaviors to brain signals. So for example, hippocampal theta oscillations that have been shown to be involved in memory-guided exploration. Just work from our group recently has linked hippocampal theta oscillations to different kinds of eye movements related to encoding or retrieval. So here on the bottom, I'm just showing you an example trace. The top 2 panels are showing you the current eye position, so X and Y coordinates, with the kind of vertical dashes showing you when a fixation occurs, and then on the bottom, we can link these up to changes in the hippocampal field potential. So just kind of as a teaser, but we have current ongoing studies relating hippocampal theta oscillations to reinstatement, consistent with what I've just been talking about here today, but it's, I think, really an exciting field, and it can open up a lot of translational work from, understanding faster mechanisms of how memories are reinstated and linking that up to brain activity. And with that, I'd just like to thank you for your attention and recognize funding agencies and all the people who have helped out developing all this line of work.
Cool. Yeah, thank you so much, Jim. That was really cool. That's exciting stuff. I got lots of questions, but we've got a discussant that I'll invite to activate his video and audio. So Brad Wyble from Penn State is going to be discussing Jim's presentation. Yeah, take it away, Brad.
Thanks, Sean. Great talk, Jim. That was really interesting. And I want to thank also the organizers of the committee for giving me this chance to sort of think about how what I do interfaces with what Jim does. And it's actually a really interesting time for me to be thinking about this, because I'm becoming increasingly a cheerleader for thinking about fixations and how they affect the way that we perceive information. So let me share just a brief little bit about what I've been thinking about with regards to this. Now, so these thoughts are very preliminary, and so they may be trivial or they may be profound. I'm not quite sure. Let me just talk through it. So the basic idea here, oops, sorry, that popped up, is that there's a lot of good reasons to think that visual fixations play a key role in shaping the temporal and the spatial context of visual input. And I come to this from a background in studying this phenomenon known as the attentional blink, which is this peculiar finding in psychophysics where if you perceive one target item amongst a dynamic stream, it becomes very difficult to see a second target item if it occurs within a range of about 300 milliseconds. And you can see that here in this U-shaped curve on the right. So this is the ability to see the second target as a function of its temporal proximity to the first target. So this has been going on for a few decades now, and at least the models that we've been developing of this phenomenon have sort of brought us around to thinking of the attentional blink as a mechanism for providing temporally discrete episodes. So you take this continuous sequence of input that we get and chop it up into short little windows in time, with the goal being not just to enhance perception in the moment, but also to provide a sort of better diet of information to downstream learning mechanisms that are trying to learn how to make sense of the statistical structure of the world. Right? So you break things into these little episodic morsels, and then you make the learning process easier and more efficient. And increasingly, we've been thinking about visual fixations as potentially having a similar role. Right? So I'm going to skip out over here and play a quick YouTube video. It just exemplifies some of what I've been thinking about. Now, I mean, we all know how eye trackers work, of course, but I want to play this example of eye tracking in the wild just to give you a sense of how discrete visual fixations are, even in a context when someone is moving around, right? And you can see that even as they're walking, their head is moving. The visual fixations tend to latch very nicely onto specific objects and stay there for periods of a few hundred milliseconds. So what this is going to do is it's going to provide the visual cortex with a representation that is relatively static over time for at least this brief window. And by the way, this is too funny to not share, but chickens do this even more extraordinarily. So what he's going to do here is he's going to passively move the body of the chicken and watch the head. This is a YouTube channel called Smarter Every Day. So what you're going to see is that as he moves that head around, as he moves the body around, the head remains, let me get to a good spot, remains absolutely fixed in its position, right? So what's going on is that the positional sensors inside the chicken are allowing its head to stay and completely counteract these body motions. Now, so the way that the human visual system does this is through a set of circuits built down into the brainstem that take input from the vestibular system and feed that into the ocular motor system and allow us to automatically compensate for changes in angular head acceleration and velocity. And we can do the same thing with cameras using 3D gimbals. So the idea here is that the visual fixations basically provide this act of taking the temporally continuous visual world and chopping it up into these discrete eye fixations. And then on top of that, you might also have attentional mechanisms like the attentional blink, which are creating even more sparse and discrete representations from that. So that out of this continuous stream of information, you end up with these relatively discrete memories that are being encoded. And on top of that, we have this sort of skating along the surface of this is the phenomenon of visual experience, which seems relatively constant. So it's interesting that we don't necessarily see, feel these sort of ebbs and flows in our temporal attention on this very short time scale. But nonetheless, the memories that we're constructing might have this very discrete character to them. So that's the sort of temporal side of what fixations might be doing for us. And I've also been thinking more about the spatial side too, right? So we all know that the retina, of course, has a very non-homogeneous concentration of receptors, right? So at the fovea, which is roughly right about here, there's this enormously dense concentration of cones, which you can see here, the blue ones. In the eccentricity, the cones drop off to a very low baseline, and the rods, there's a lot of rods, but actually the rods aren't doing much for us during daylight vision. So your rods are all pretty much saturated right now and not really helping you see. So basically you're seeing primarily with your cones. And in addition to this dense concentration in the retina, there's also a concentration of processing in the visual cortex, right? So this is a basically stretched out map of visual cortex showing you at different, so 1 degree, 2 degrees, 4, 8, 16, you can basically see this logarithmic drop off in surface area as you move away from the fovea. So what this means is that the sort of central 4 degrees of the visual field, the fovea, is processed by approximately a quarter of the visual cortex.
About 4 minutes.
Okay, thanks. So what this means is that, if you think of cortical magnification, obviously it greatly exaggerates the processing of what's at the fovea, but it also provides a sort of inherent figure ground segmentation where we still have access to some of that information in the periphery. So I wanted to sort of think about, like, what does this look like in the context of an image, like what Jim is doing with multiple fixations, right? So you got, let's say someone fixates here, and what I did then was run this through a log polar transform in OpenCV. And this is a sort of crude approximation of what the visual cortex might be seeing, right? This is the information underneath the fixation cross, and this is the information at greater eccentricities over here. And then if the eyes move to a different location, right, now you're going to see a representation that might look like this. So this is the guy with the backpack. You can see here's his head. And then this is all the other stuff out in the periphery. And then another fixation, and we see that over here. Right. So what this means is that there's this graded sense of similarity across foveal to eccentricity regions within the visual field, right? So within the same images, as you move from one fixation to another, the information at the fovea is going to be highly dissimilar, but the information in the periphery is going to be highly similar. So this provides a sort of inherent bonding of individual fixations to a stable spatial context, right? So in the kind of images that Jim was just showing us, each one of these fixations is going to have a single image, a single sort of point of fixation, and they're going to be bound to a relatively consistent spatial context that's derived from all of the rest of the content in the image. And what's even more interesting is if you think about this across images, across contexts, is that, so for imagine, you've got 3 fixations within picture A. Information in the periphery is going to be relatively consistent, even though the foveal information is highly dissimilar. But as you switch to a different picture, now you're going to have this new situation where the first fixation in the second picture is going to be highly dissimilar throughout the entire visual cortex, and then become similar again for further fixations within that one. So in a sense, what you end up with is a sort of hierarchical spatial binding process that comes along for free, essentially, within the visual cortex, right? The visual cortex is already doing this sort of grouping of the spatial context with the item information, and that information would then be passed up the chain to the rest of the ventral stream and the hippocampus. And the reason that I find this interesting is I'm thinking a lot these days about learning. How does the brain learn from the environment in this unsupervised fashion? And I really don't think that it's just a matter of finding the correct algorithm. I think that it's finding the correct algorithm plus a large number of individual heuristics. And I think that fixations is one of those heuristics that provides a combination of spatial and temporal distinction that greatly accelerates the learning process. Right, so the TLDR, I guess, of what I've been talking about here is that, it's useful to take really seriously the role of fixations in sculpting the way that our visual system samples information from the world. And so, Jim's talk was a great way of sort of thinking about how we can leverage this to better understand how memory works. And, this functions both in time and in space. And I think that there's a lot of gains that can be made in thinking about fixations more deeply.
Well, cool. Well, thank you, Brad. That's great. All right, great discussion. So while I start looking through the questions, Jim, do you have any comments off of that?
Yeah, so I guess one thing that immediately came to mind is just the idea that, so the idea that temporal information and how, fixation sample over time is probably very important for understanding these processes. And really what I'm trying to say here is that, so fixations have different durations, and the amount of time you spend looking at a part of the screen can really tell you, or a scene can tell you a lot of information about what might be going on cognitively. And so that's something that I kind of glossed over in the way I analyze the data, but really what your representation of the scene is might vary a lot depending on, how long these different fixations are going on for. And so your representation of the scene, both in terms of just like ordinal time versus, more probably complete representations of the scene as, visual inputs actually unfolds, probably a very interesting question for kind of future research.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Actually, that I think leads into this Hive question here from Mark Howard, who says he thinks this is an amazing connection between list memory and more naturalistic memory, really innovative and important. Eye movements are not a linearly ordered list. They have all kinds of higher order structure, both at study and retrieval. Do you have thoughts about how to generalize the contiguity effect for these more complex experiences? And what's the generalization of the contiguity effect for sequences with higher order dependencies? Mm-hmm.
Could you say that last part again real quick?
What's the generalization of the contiguity effect for sequences with higher order dependencies? So I guess if there's other kinds of dependencies in there, what are we looking at? Are we still going to call it the contiguity effect?
Yeah, so I mean, it's just definitely an interesting question to think about. So at some level, some of these contiguity effects might not necessarily be, it's a question as to what the actual underlying representation is that give rise to the behavior that we're observing. And so it might be more related to kind of just extracting regularities out of, the inputs that you've been seeing recently, and just a way of representing kind of what features follow in time, in just a generalized way of kind of extracting these kind of regularities from the environment. But yeah, it's an interesting question to think about.
Any thoughts, Brad?
Yeah, I mean, of course, I completely agree that, this is true, that there's got to be a lot of higher order structure in there. And I think the question is, how do you sort of build a formalized way of understanding what that structure is?
I guess, Jim, did you with your Scanpath of cross subjects, that kind of starts to get at this, right? It's like, it was sort of like looking at how one person's Scanpath might be the same as someone else's Scanpath.
Yeah, so, I mean, I guess I should mention that there's kind of one caveat with that type of analysis. So while you could say that only has to do, or that's showing you stimulus-driven effects and doesn't show memory, there are also going to be a lot of individual differences in how different people view scenes. But so the idea is that generally there might be regularities just from the environment that are consistent to a person. So you could have like a perfect model of, given any stimulus, this is how this person will view the stimulus. And then the question is, do you actually need an episodic memory of previous instances to influence that, or can you just view it the way you would typically view it? So it's you can imagine different kinds of representations for both of those in terms of informing just based on current perceptual inputs. This is where I predict this is how I'm going to look, as opposed to the need for some specific kind of other type of representation, or here's your past experience.
Yeah, and there are also sometimes fixations that don't necessarily land on an object, but land sort of as a sampling process in between objects, and then drive future saccades as well. So it's not always, yeah, as you know, it's not always just like jumping from object to object, but sometimes just sort of figuring out where to go next. But that can also have a hierarchical structure.
Yeah, yeah. I wonder if that relates to in free recall, you can just have someone say everything that comes to their mind during the search and see where they're landing in between valid responses. Maybe. Let's see. Let's do one more question, and then we will move on to the next. Let's see. So, Jia Ho is the reinstatement related to the number of salient objects / features within the image, such that reinstatement is greater for images with more features, and as such, leading to better scene recognition?
Yeah, and so it's a very interesting question. There's a lot of different factors that go into kind of scene memorability, and then at the same time, there are a lot of different factors that go into whether or not a given scene is one that you're likely to reinstate Scanpaths on. So I have some data that can speak to that, which I didn't present, which is that in general, after accounting for how similar you might expect a Scanpath to be just based on the stimulus alone, there still is a relationship between memorability and how likely you are to reinstate Scanpaths. But then at the same time, there's like from more basic studies of scene memorability, it's often the case that scenes with centrally presented single objects are well recognized. So there's a lot that goes into memorability. I think it's probably a pretty complicated task of picking apart how much of it is, I think it's going to depend on the full scene and a lot of complex features. But I would definitely say that in general, it looks like your ability to reinstate Scanpaths is part of it.
Cool. Well, all right. I think that's a great place to bring our discussion to a close so we can get back onto the schedule. And so thanks to our speakers. Thanks, Jim, and thanks, Brad, for an excellent talks and discussions. And now moving right along, our next speaker is Cassandra Jacobs from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and she'll be telling us about the Lexical Context Model of memory for words and lists. Hello.
Hey, you can hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. I'm not echoey?
Not for me.
Okay, cool. Let's see if where's this share screen?
Cool.
All right.
Excellent.
Awesome. Okay, so I'm super excited to be here. I hope that you'll enjoy the talk. The whole idea that we were starting out with, this is some joint work with Dave Huber, was it would be really nice if we could synthesize semantic and episodic memory into a single model. So that's what today's attempt will show you. And historically, semantic and episodic memory are thought to be different systems, that there are memories that something happened, when something happened, who did what and when, but then there are memories that are distinct, so our knowledge of words, facts about what lives in the jungle versus what lives in the desert. And these are generally thought to be different, but at the same time, we know that one can feed into the other. So our knowledge of words can impact our ability to encode a list. Our knowledge of time can affect our ability to retrieve a word. And these two things intermix. This is especially important when we think about how most computational models of memory integrate word representations. So many models use corpus-based word vector representations that others have talked about to some extent earlier in the conference. So a model like latent semantic analysis or word2vec will ingest a large data set of written English or French or any language in the world, and it will learn roughly coherent semantics. So it'll learn that dog and cat are similar, and they will therefore have similar word vector representations. These have been incorporated into many different episodic memory models and in many different ways, though very few of them integrate them directly into the learning mechanism associated with the model. So the goal here is to basically see if we can treat learning words in lists in episodic memory tasks as effectively the same thing as learning words in other contexts. So because we know that words in study lists are not just items, we should be able to say, okay, well, words in lists function in relation to the other words that are in that list. So we're just going to take the model of the continuous bag of words model, one of the two instantiations of word2vec, and we're going to basically teach it memory lists. And so this will be the lexical context model. To orient you a little bit to the architecture of the model that we're using, although I don't think that this is particularly critical, the model is a 3-layer neural network architecture. It uses context to predict words. And in particular, it uses prediction error from this context to word prediction task to learn associations between words without directly observing necessarily the same two words together. So you'll learn that a word like cat and a word like dog are similar in meaning because they occur in similar linguistic contexts, not because they occur together. And one of the nice things about this model is that it has a notion of context that is temporally defined. So there are words to the left in a list and words to the right in a list, or words to the left and right in a sentence. And it just amalgamates those into a single feature vector that's used to predict a given word. And I'll show you what that looks like on the next slide. But the idea here is that we're going to train a model that already knows a lot about the statistics of words in English, and then we're just going to extend that by teaching it word lists. So if we have an example list like the one on the right, cat, pizza, apple, telephone, truck, doctor, zebra, eggs, we're going to treat each single word in this as the target of a prediction task. So we'll use cat, for example, as the outcome of the very first list that the model has to learn. And we're going to use pizza and apple as input to the model. So we'll use the surrounding words to predict a word at a given index. And we'll just do this with different amounts of context depending on how far we are in the list for each word in the list. So one of the things that is kind of nice about this is we can actually test a wide variety of phenomena that we know occur in episodic memory tasks. First, I'll show you that our model, with a couple of simple additional metrics, can filter out studied from unstudied items. I'll then show you the canonical primacy and recency effects that the model is able to capture, as well as list length and DRM effects. So filtering out unstudied words is a two-stage process in this model, just so that we can get a notion of, well, we first have to find words that are likely to have been studied, and then we can figure out if that memory of that word has a sufficient strength. So we'll have two distance metrics that we're going to be computing. The first of which is the distance between the word that we're studying, say cat, and the entire rest of the list. So the whole list that I showed you a couple slides ago. And we're just going to sum up all of those distances, and we'll translate it into a probability. And then we'll do the exact same thing with another metric, but let me show you first that there are two very different ranges of values for words that are studied versus words that are not studied. So studied items tend to be much closer to the list, all of the words in the list, than they are to unstudied items. So unstudied items tend to be very dissimilar for the list, and studied items are pretty similar, which is what we want the learning mechanism to do. We then can compute the words change after. Okay, so we'll check the words, the amount of change that the word has in its own representation before and after. And this will get at the idea that words that change a lot might end up being more difficult to retrieve. And this is also something that we can quantify and turn into a probability, with words that are studied changing to different degrees and words that are unstudied changing not at all. Okay, so given those two things, we're just going to multiply those probabilities together for a probability of recall. And I'll just be plotting the probability of recall based on these measures for all of the subsequent plots. So to show you how primacy and recency look in this model, I'll be plotting serial position on the x-axis and the probability of recall on the y-axis. And the model correctly captures both primacy and recency effects without any additional mechanisms. These similarity functions naturally produce this curve, and unstudied items largely are not being considered. by the model. We might note that the primacy and recency differences are not exactly the same as what we canonically see in the lab, so feel free to ask me during the question section why it might look like that. Then I'll show you that longer lists have worse memory than shorter lists. We can basically just artificially change word lists from any given study and truncate them to different lengths. So I'll show you the memory for lists ranging from 5 to 15. And as you can see, short lists have greater memorability and long lists have worse memorability. And in particular, that's a function of the length of the list. So it's not just an artifact. It really does seem to be driven by list length. And then finally, I think this is one of the strongest arguments for using a pre-trained model of semantics. We're able to capture the DRM effect without having to build any new mechanisms in. And in particular, for the DRM effect, let's say that you study a list of a whole bunch of things related to sleep, dreaming, drowsy, and so on. But then you never actually see the word sleep. We expect there to be intrusions because those lists are designed to make people say that word. So if we compare memory for words that people actually did study from that list, performance is relatively high, and they make some intrusions, like anyone does on a memory task. But importantly, the model correctly captures that semantically related words that are cued by a given list are actually more likely to be intruded than other unrelated words. So the model is capturing a wide variety of effects, and I think that this provides a really compelling account that you can integrate episodic memory and semantic memory into a single framework. And even small updates in a model of episodic memory or in a model of semantic memory can give you these basic findings. And I think more broadly, I'm really excited about challenging the notion that episodic and semantic memory are completely dissociated. And I'm really interested in pushing the envelope on this as we go forward.
Great. Very cool. Yeah.
Oh, what happens if I do this? Does it show you the PowerPoint still? But like.
Oh, now it's gone.
Okay.
So
okay.
while people are thinking about what questions they might want to ask, I'll get us started. I'm curious to hear. Well, first of all, that was really cool. Thank you.
Thanks.
And I'd love to hear more about so it looks like the primacy and recency effects that you do get a sort of like distinctiveness effects somehow, like edge.
Yeah, so you can think of them as edge effects. Yeah. So one of the natural consequences of the way we train the model is because we train from left to right, and words that are on the edges of the list have less context. That could be contributing to the degree to which those items can change in their representations. So even if you go over the same list multiple times, there's still less error that will ultimately be calculated or backpropagated because it's not getting multiple sources of information. So there are some elements of it that I'm not totally sure about, but I think the most compelling thing is we see this with a wide variety of different measures. So if we use even the probability that the model guesses that a word is at that position instead of a similarity measure, you get the exact same pattern of results. So it's just that the items on the edges are less predictable. They're therefore less strongly associated with the contexts. And I think that's partly what's going on there.
Ah, okay.
Yeah. So words in the middle are less memorable
very cool,
because
very
they're too contexty. They represent the gist.
Okay, so now.
Well.
Oh yeah. And I just saw there is a question from Nora Newcomb.
Okay.
I suppose it's more of a comment now that I look at it. Another way to view these data is that free recall isn't really about episodic memory.
That's a spicy take.
So, I like it.
I'm not ready to go there yet, but one of the things in the lab where I work right now is thinking about how much of even short-term memory, verbal working memory is an artifact of the language production architecture. So I think that there's a lot of open questions where this model might be able to ask similarly spicy questions.
Oh, yeah, I like that perspective, that way of putting it, yeah. All right, so there's one more question that got posted. Is the idea that during episodic memory, the MTL is building its own word-to-vec representation on top of the semantics? From Eigen.
That's a great question. I wish that I knew enough about the brain to really say, but I think that this is related to a lot of the brain discussions that have been going on. I don't quite have the expertise for that. I know that I've had some discussions with folks about how this could relate to consolidation, and that, well, we would kind of hope that episodic information does get integrated into long-term memory representations of things like dogs and cats and our knowledge of how cars work or whatever it is. So yeah, I think that there's a lot of really interesting neural mechanisms that still need to be teased out.
Cool.
Or how this model might work that way.
Well, I think that's a good place to bring it to a close, and thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you all.
Yeah, yeah, everyone, thank you to our speaker, Cassandra Jacobs. And now the final presentation of the day, and then at the end of this one, I'll have a couple of parting announcements, but for now, we can get right into it. So our next speaker is Simon Dennis from the University of Melbourne, and his talk is using experience sampling data to investigate memory for where is all caps acronym. Hey, Simon.
Hey, fine. Okay, just trying to figure out how do I.
If you like hover over your name or something, I think it gives you an option to share your screen. Hey.
How's that going? Is that looking right?
Yeah, we can see it. So yeah, take it away, Simon.
Take it away, great, excellent. So thanks everyone for allowing me to talk today. And my name's Simon Dennis. I'm going to be talking about memory for where. And so in 1984, Ronald Cotton was convicted for 2 counts of rape and 2 counts of burglary. He was sentenced to life plus 50 years. And in 1995, he was exonerated after spending over 10 years in prison when DNA evidence demonstrated his innocence. So this is a well-known case in the memory literature because the victim actually falsely identified Cotton on 3 separate occasions. But there's another important aspect of the case that's often overlooked, and that's that he misremembered where he'd been at the time of the crimes. And so that, of course, led the jurors to the conclusion that he was lying. So what he did is he remembered where he had been the week before instead of the actual week of the crime, but at that same time. So what we might hope is that memory science would be able to give us a handle on these kinds of issues. So how probable is that kind of error? However, for the most part, we kind of struggle to do that. So we can learn some lessons from the laboratory, but if we really want to start to answer these questions in any kind of quantitative way, we need to get out into the real world and collect data. And so that's what we've been doing. So in the experiment I'm going to talk about today, we had people collect data for 2 weeks. And so that included accelerometry vectors 10 times a second continuously. So that's about 25 million points per subject. We had GPS coordinates collected every 10 minutes, and we had audio collected every 10 minutes. So these were kind of short 3-second segments. And then we also asked people to rate their emotions, so 11 discrete emotions, 8 times a day on a 100-point scale. After a week's retention interval, we brought them, administered a test, and what we're interested in is their ability to remember where they were at a given time. So each trial gave them a map and a time. So in this case, it's Thursday morning, 8 a.m. On August 15th. And they were given 4 alternatives. All of the options, the places that they had been, this particular person had been, but they had to choose which one they'd been at that particular time. And they were correct about 67% of the time, which of course means they were wrong about 1/3 of the time. So it's certainly the case that people are far from perfect when they try to answer these questions. If we think about Cotton-specific error, so where he had the wrong week but the right day, that happens about 19% of the time, which is well above chance. So that is in fact a dominant kind of error that investigators should be aware of. Now, what we wanted to do is to be able to model this. And so we wanted to create a kind of memory network to capture this data. So the representation, we created nodes for accelerometry, audio, and GPS clusters. Each of these were clustered within participants. We created nodes for the hours of the day, the days of the week, and the weeks, and then we created nodes for the 11 discrete emotions. Now, and we connected those nodes using what we call the max degree rule. So because these are naturally occurring data, if you just connect them according to, say, the probability of co-occurrence of these different features, then the high frequency ones just completely dominate. And so what we did is we introduced this max degree, so any given node can only be connected to n of the most frequently occurring nodes, and after that there are no connections. The strengths between the nodes were parameterized. So for, say, audio to emotion links, another strength for, say, time to location links, and so forth, and that was optimized. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to institute a queue, so it would be, say, 3 p.m. Monday, week 35, and what we want to do is have activation spread through our network until it reaches our response options. So the queues are in green, the response options are in blue here. And so the most obvious way to do that is to have activation, or to use a power iteration. So we take the state of the activations at one step, multiply it by the weight matrix, and normalize and continue doing that until we get a activation for each of the nodes of the network. Now, it's well known, though, that if you do that, what you end up with is the primary eigenvector of the memory network, or the matrix, regardless of what input you put in. And so that's kind of a problem. A memory system that can only ever produce one response is not particularly useful. And this is well known, and so in the 1960s and 70s, Hopfield and Anderson introduced nonlinearities into these kinds of systems in order to have the state of the system go to one of the corners of a hypercube, and in this way allow it to produce more than one response. We want to be able to have graded responses so that we can talk about the how likely it is that each of the different response options will be chosen. And so instead of introducing nonlinearities, what we did is we temporarily updated the weight. So we take the input pattern, we take the outer product of it with itself, add that into the weight matrix, and then we do the power iteration on that. So what we're doing is we're effectively dynamically altering the eigenstructure of the network, which perhaps might be something that is a function of short-term plasticity. And so that allows us to have graded responses.
About 4 minutes.
Okay. So yeah, the whole network is kind of complicated to be able to understand. So what I've done here is pull away, or just take out those links that are connected either to a queue or to a response, just so that we can see what's going on this particular trial. So again, we've instantiated the queue, which is 3 p.m. Monday, week 35. And you can see how these are connected to the various different nodes. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to speculate that GPS location D is this person's home. And so I'm making that inference by virtue of the fact that it's connected to Sunday and to Saturday and to relaxed and to happy. By contrast, I'm going to argue that this person's GPS option D is this person's workplace. And I'm doing that because it's connected to the Friday and Monday and to all of the hours of the workday. And so you can see in this case, right, that options D and B have been activated to pretty similar degrees. The correct answer in this case is D. The participant produced D. And so I think what's going on there is that normally on at a 3 p.m. on Monday, they would be at their workplace. But in this particular occasion, they were at home, and that's caused them to misremember that particular on that particular trial. And you can see that the model is also capturing some of that confusion because the structure of people's experience is built into its structure. So what we found is we trained the model across all of our participants, and the model was correct just over 51% of the time. In this case, chances 25% of the time. So we're clearly capturing something of the underlying structure of people's retrieval. The model was optimized, as I said before, by adjusting the connection strengths between different modalities. And so what you can see here is that the GPS to time connection is quite strong, and that's perhaps unsurprising given that the task was to use time to retrieve GPS. But you can see that there are other connections which are as strong or stronger. So the connection between audio nodes and emotion nodes in time is also very strong. The connection between accelerometry and audio and emotion is also very strong. So the overall performance of the network is a consequence of all of these connections. One thing that is interesting is that the emotion to emotion connections were very weak. And so that suggests to me that just thinking of emotion in terms of these 11 discrete categories is probably not the right representation, and we need to continue to work on that.
About a minute.
Okay. So in conclusion, after a 1 to 3 week retention interval, people are able to identify where they were about 2/3 of the time. And so that's an important result in itself for applied reason. So we really need to be creating a memory science that can start to answer some of these questions about the reliability of people's everyday memory, and also how that might apply to forensic context. I've introduced here the dynamic Eigen network, as we call it, with max degree learning rule, and that captures about 51% of participant choices. So that does, a reasonable choice. There's not a lot of reasonable job. There's not a lot to benchmark it against at this point, but it's certainly capturing something. I guess one of the things, and this relates somewhat to the previous talk, is that what we're proposing here is that generalization, or at least a large portion of generalization, is happening at retrieval rather than an encoding. So with LSA or word2vec, those kinds of processes, you're kind of assuming that the structure is being encoded, and the relationship between representations is encoded or is occurring at encoding. Whereas in this network, it's the retrieval operation where the generalization is happening. And we're arguing that that's happening as a consequence of this dynamic reconfiguration of the Eigen structure, perhaps as a consequence of short-term plasticity. And finally, more generally, I want to argue that experience sampling allows us to make models that are informed by the structure of an individual's entire environment. So rather than just picking out, small segments of their learning history, we're taking, a broad view of all of their learning history and allowing that to influence the performance on the trial. So thanks for listening.
Yeah, very cool. Thank you, Simon. That's awesome. Wow, so we had two interesting models that sort of diverge from sort of some of the standards that we've seen recently, but take us in very cool directions. Or the one posted comment by Gordon Logan: "Where were you last Wednesday at 3 p.m.?" Joke.
Oh, right. I should point out that I'm actually in Australia, so it's the sun is rising outside my window at the moment.
Time is even more unreal. Yeah, so I wonder, I think it's very cool, and I think as other people sort of think whether they want to post a question in there, I'd like to ask, what was it? Right, this idea that you brought up. So there's been some recent work, instance theory of semantic memory by, I guess, Mike Jones was involved with that one. I'm blanking on the other authors. The idea being that a lot of the action can take place at retrieval when you've got a simple model, like an instance theoretic model, right? And
I mean, this is not necessarily a new idea, right? So Hintzman had this schema abstraction idea back in the late 80s. So that part of it's not entirely new, but I think it offers a lot of advantages because it's obviously more flexible. If at retrieval, you know what the task is, whereas at encoding, you don't know what the task is. So it also helps to, I think, understand how it's possible out of a relatively sparsely connected system to have these kinds of generalizations arise.
Yeah, well, it looks like we've got some other questions that are popping up. Ida Momenajad says, thank you for a fantastic talk. If I understand correctly, Eigen Networks cluster interconnected segments, hence the retrieval effect. But adding new branches/memories to an existing network requires search too. Could encoding also get affected by the network? So I guess
yeah. So I guess it's always possible, right? Well, I guess this is somewhat controversial, but one expects that in most situations there's a combination of encoding and retrieval occurring, and that each can influence each other. So yeah, I wouldn't be at all surprised to find that was the case.
Yeah. Let's see, one more, and then we'll wrap up. Do you have responses about how often participants at specific locations? Perhaps they oversample Mondays at lab, leading to more likely model participant differences. So do people, tend to, I guess it would be, do people tend to maybe have particular places they spend a lot of time in, and how that might affect?
Yeah, absolutely. And so that's what I guess I was trying to capture in that last example there, is that those regularities, because we're encoding memories for every, so I should have said this, it's every hour period is what we encoded. So, and that's 24/7 for the whole 2 weeks. So, so the background memory model has all of that information in it. But I think one of the interesting things that I've found is the use of this max degree rule. So, because what that does is it actually kind of requires a competition between different links to actually be the thing that connects to a given node. And that, I think, certainly because we do a lot of stuff with language as well, and that leads to some really useful properties in these Zipfian kinds of environments, because you find that things like topics and so forth fall out in a very straightforward way in a single pass, without all of the model passes that we typically do with neural nets or topics models or something like that, just because of that Zipfian environment and using that max degree rule. So I think that that kind of structure needs some kind of constraint on it. So it's, because if you just allow those high frequency things to accumulate, you want it to affect it, but you don't want it to affect it too much.
Right. Well, cool. All right. Well, that was a strong end to our second day of the conference, and let's all thank our speaker, Simon Dennis, and all of our speakers for informative and entertaining and exciting science. So before we shut me down, I'll just say that if you click on the schedule and more button below, or if you have the link from yesterday to the social page, that you can follow that to another social event, since we had our posters in the morning today. And tomorrow, things will get started with talks, and the posters will be at the end of the day. So tomorrow at 11 Eastern, we will get rolling again. And yeah, thank you so much, everyone. This has been great. It's so great to see everyone's names in chat. And and James, I see, just said that for the social, it's a different link than yesterday. So do go to the page that has that link. All right. See y'all.